You're listening to the Valley College Connection podcast, where John Kawai and Scott Wigan, two Valley professors, engage in a conversation about success with educators and students. Each week, they'll sit down with a different guest to find out ways each of us have had to plan, persevere, and overcome to be where we are now. The show will also highlight resources and services that are working to make a difference at Los Angeles Valley College. John and Scott believe that all of us and the college itself are a work in progress. And in this podcast, they'll explore on a more personal level how the community can work together to support each other as we move forward with our goals.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the podcast, Denice. We're really happy that you are here and that you're able to sit down with us.
Yeah, great. I'm glad to be here.
We wanted to take this opportunity to chat a little bit with you and find out a little bit more about your backstory, about who you are, what brought you to Valley, some of your strategies for teaching, and some of the advice that perhaps you'd like to give to students. With that, if you could share with us, maybe starting sort of, how did you come to be here at Valley College?
Okay, sure. So I think I should probably start with the fact that I never actually thought that I was going to go to college. I came from a working class family where college and higher education wasn't really valued. You just work. You don't necessarily go to school. There's not much there. Not that, there was any issue with going to school, but nobody just really ever thought of it. And my dad ended up actually going to college because he was a veteran, but he wasn't with my mom when I was young, and my mom never really thought about college, so I didn't really think about college. So I was actually the first woman in my family to get not only a four-year degree, but also a graduate degree. And the thing that actually started me thinking about going to college was the fact that I was, ended up as a single mother with a 6-month-old baby and very few options in terms of, job possibilities. And somebody said, why don't you go take a few classes at the local community college and maybe do a child development major or something so you can at least teach. And I started here here at Valley College in probably 91 or 92, took a couple of classes, and then came back after my son was born. I actually had to show my son's birth certificate to my professor so he didn't drop me from the class because I missed the first day of class. And so I was a child development major and took as an elective a Sociology of Women class from Pat Allen, who just recently retired. And as I sat in that Sociology of Women class, I thought to myself, this is the thing that I have to do. Mm-hmm. The idea that there were thoughts and conversations that were being had about issues that directly impacted me had never really crossed my mind until I sat in that class. And so I brought my baby along with me to every class and changed my major to sociology. And, in that class, she had a component where you had to go out into the community and do some community work and do some volunteering. Mm-hmm. And I volunteered at a local domestic violence and sexual assault hotline, which led me to basically the next 25 to 30 years of my work in the field. So without Valley College in that class, I probably would not be doing what I'm doing now, certainly, but not have been able to do the multiple things that I've been able to do. So
wow, that's really interesting how oftentimes we'll have one experience sort of transition us into another experience completely unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. For you, when you were here, your first semester at Valley and perhaps taking that class with Professor Allen, were you thinking at that point about transferring, getting a 4-year degree, or were you sort of just, hey, I'm here at Valley, I'm going to take a few classes and kind of see how this feels?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a working single mom, I don't know if I thought that far in advance. I sort of thought what was going to happen today or tomorrow. Right. But when I when I transitioned from the child development major into the sociology major, folks in the sociology department were talking about the potential to transfer, to go on. This was before we had a lot of the transfer agreements that we currently have. And by the time I had finished classes here, I just felt like there was more to learn and more to do. And so it became part of what I decided I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do it because, of course, I didn't have the time or the money, just like a lot of people. But it became part of, my goal to do. So then I transferred to CSUN. Was a sociology and women's studies major at CSUN, and actually at CSUN was introduced to a perspective in terms of my own experience that was very different than I had experienced prior to that, in that my experience became connected to other people's experience. So I was a sociology and gender studies major, and I began to take courses in Chicano studies and African American studies, and really began to see the parallels of my own experience within these communities, and so it was meaningful.
How comfortable did you feel being a parent at CSUN?
Well, I was more comfortable here being a parent when I was at Valley. I had amazing professors. I remember Pat Allen used to let me bring my son to class with me. I had a former professor here in African American Studies, Barbara Stouffer, who the day of the final exam, my son was sick and had a fever, and so I couldn't take him to childcare, and so I brought him into class, and I was in tears because I thought I'm not going to be able to take my final, and she held him the whole time while I took my final exam. So definitely here at Valley, I found that there was a lot of community and investment in my efforts to, learn and to be in the space. It was a little harder at CSUN, I think primarily because I was a transfer student who was also a non-traditional student, and so I hadn't been introduced to maybe some resources that would have been available to help me. I did certainly in my women's studies classes, I had a lot of professors who were open to my son coming, but it was a different environment. So it was a little more challenging, I think, to be a single parent at a 4U university than it was here.
Do you find that what you talked about, the questions you asked, were different because you were a non-traditional student?
Oh, absolutely. And I noticed that even in my classes now, that for me, what felt really important was to understand experiences that I had had or was having, and to think about them within the context of that experience. And as a single parent, a working parent, a non-traditional student, I had lots of experiences to draw from that were a little bit different and foreign probably to my peers.
Right.
So yeah, definitely. It certainly influenced the way that I thought about my education. I also was very focused because I only had a certain amount of time. I had a growing child. I didn't have a lot of time to mess around, so I was very focused in terms of my timing and how long it took me, which was a little challenging for me when my own son went to school and was a little less focused. But yeah, I think I thought about things differently as a non-traditional student in that environment.
And do you think that, how do you set up your class differently because of that experience?
Well, so I set up my class, when I talk to students, I introduce this in the syllabus and in the very first week of class. I say that this is a critical classroom. And what I mean by saying this is a critical classroom is that this is a place that we bring ideas and experiences where we can talk about them within the context of theory and structure that allow us to understand them. But it's not my job to stand at the front of the class and tell you everything that you need to know. You know, part of my job as a professor is really to be a facilitator, a facilitator of knowledge. And, you know, one of the agreements that I make with my students at the beginning is that we develop collective knowledge in the classroom.
Right.
And so those experiences as a non-traditional student, when I would, you know, offer an experience in class to my professors, if it was engaged and became part of the class discussion and seemed to be acknowledged as relevant and important, then it was so much more interesting for me to learn. And for me to be able to share and in some ways teach my professors too about my own experience, really informed the way that my classroom is currently structured. I tell my students from the very beginning that I'm not responsible for their learning in the class. That as a community, we're responsible for the knowledge that's developed within the walls of the classroom.
Great.
Well, I kind of took you off your trajectory. So
okay.
once you were at CSUN and you got your degree, what happened after that?
Well, so when I was at Valley and I had started volunteering for that hotline, I continued to work for that organization for more than 15 years. And so while I was at CSUN, I was working for that organization, which was a local domestic violence and sexual violence organization.
Can I stop you right there for just a second? Because I think that perhaps your experience, you started off volunteering there. You said it was
volunteering
an intern?
in class, and then became
okay.
a student.
Okay. And so sometimes I think that's an opportunity that our students don't necessarily see, the benefit of doing that type of service learning or volunteering, and understanding that can ultimately lead to paid work as well, as let alone finding something that you're really passionate about. So your story is a really great example of that.
Right, absolutely. And I volunteered for probably almost 3 years before I began to work at the organization. And then as a worker at that organization, I got progressively more authority. I moved up and did a lot more things that I really thought were interesting and that I wanted to do, but was also responsible and took on the responsibility of facilitating a lot more other opportunities for volunteers to come into the organization.
Okay.
And volunteering became a critical part of the work that I did, because it felt to me like each of us has an obligation to each other. And so whether my initial introduction to volunteering was clearly in a educational setting, but it became so important that it was something that I wanted to really continue to do, not only in my work outside of the classroom to facilitate opportunities for people to give back within their own communities and to be part of the community, but also in my classroom. We are absolutely, I understand I'm on the service learning list. I'm not sure if I knew I was there, but I understand I'm there. I think primarily because it's so critical. As somebody who became an academic, and I say that in air quotes, right? Later in life, so much of my work was in practice.
Right.
And so when I come into the classroom, I bring a connection between sort of the ideas and the theory and what that really looks like when we put it into practice in the community. And so that's a critical part of learning.
Right. Oftentimes in academia is that connection sometimes isn't made. It's the proverbial isolation of the ivory tower. Now, for you, so maybe this kind of is a segue back to your trajectory, so to speak. So you were at CSUN. You were continuing to work at the hotline in different capacities at this point now. Graduating CSUN with your degree, and then what? What did you decide from there?
So I went to work full-time with the organization that I was working for. I became very passionate about the work that I was doing, working not only with people who had experienced vulnerability and harm, but also being part of a community where I could talk about issues that were really impactful to all of us. What I recognized as I was doing that work in the community was that there were a lot of gaps in the legal system for people who had experienced domestic or sexual violence. And so I decided to go to law school. So I actually worked full-time while I went to law school. I went to an evening program.
Okay.
Because I wanted to understand how the law impacted people who were vulnerable and people in general in communities. And, when I graduated from law school, I actually developed within that same organization the first legal services program that was actually housed in a domestic violence and sexual assault program.
Oh,
so
wow.
there have been other legal aid organizations that had partnered, but this was, I developed the very first one that was going to serve victims specifically of domestic and sexual violence. And so my job was to bring in volunteers from the community, whether they were lawyers or others, to help people who had experienced harm understand how to maneuver this system.
Right.
And then later became very interested in writing laws and policy. And so began to work at a local and statewide level on legislative development, writing state law, and later, sat with the Department of Education, actually, when they developed the new Title IX regulations related to sexual violence. I was part of the team that worked with the federal government in doing that.
Wow.
So,
gosh.
all because I sat in a classroom here at Valley College. I do think it's important, and I've said this before, and I often say this to my students. One thing, the reality is that we just don't know, right, what things are going to bring us. We just don't know the way that our lives are going to go. I would have never in a million years thought that I would be an invitee of the United States Department of State to go to India and help them understand how to implement policies and laws that would protect victims of violence. Never in a million years. When I was that single parent trying to figure out how I was going to get my homework done.
Right.
And so I often remind students that even being in the classroom provides them with opportunities that they probably won't ever have expected, they won't ever know are coming for them.
And your story is certainly an illustration of that. I mean, such a powerful story to be able to share. So you mentioned just there that your work brought you to India. Where else did you travel by way of your work at that point in your life?
So I spent a good portion, probably about 5 or 6 years, traveling around the country. So I've been to states all over the country, working specifically with community-based organizations and universities to try to develop policies that would promote gender equity, that would prevent gendered violence. So I've been all over the country several times, working with the Department of Justice and the Department of Education at the federal government level, the Office of Emergency Services at the state level. I was invited to work with the Sexual Assault Coalition in Scotland. They have a national. In the U.S., everything's sort of state by state, but in the U.K. in different areas, it's primarily like a state-run NGO. So their state-run NGO invited me to come and talk to them about how to really engage the community and being able to do prevention work related to gender-based violence. I worked with a very small community. I had gone to central Mexico, Cuernavaca, to take a Spanish language immersion program, which didn't work completely, except that it was really interesting. The program was a Women in Social Change program, and so they had brought in lots of activists from the community to talk to us as students.
Okay.
And as I was sharing with some of my work with some of the professors in that program, they asked me to share with their community some of the work that we had done here in the U.S. related to that. So I was able to share with that community of activists my work. So.
Right.
So let me ask this. Let's say I'm someone who's really interested in the Me Too movement. Let's say that I'm 21 years old. How do I start? Like, how do I start having these interesting experiences? What's the first step? What advice would you give?
Right. The first step is starting, and starting somewhere, and starting anywhere. I think one of the most critical mistakes that we often make is to wait for the right moment, to wait for the right job, to wait for the right place. If I really thought about all the things that I should have been waiting for, I probably wouldn't have had many of the experiences I had.
Right.
So finding things that are happening around you and trying it out, going and talking to the people within the community, maybe showing up to a march or a benefit, or volunteering, even a day if you don't have all kinds of time to do it. And to remember that we're all experts in our own lives, but our lives don't always apply to everybody else around us. And so as somebody who is volunteering or wanting to be involved in these movements, to really be willing to listen and learn at the same time you share and teach.
Sure. So what are some of the organizations around here that you think, if I was a young person interested in this movement, that I'd call and say, hey, do you have anything, do you need a volunteer? What are some of the organizations around here that you really respect?
Well, fortunately, our service learning program here on campus actually has a whole list of organizations, many of which I really trust and have worked with, have had students go through. So there's in the San Fernando Valley, there is an organization called Strength United that does work related to gender-based violence. And so they work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse. But not just victims, also working in the community to do some prevention work. They do a lot of great work around human trafficking, helping to work with law enforcement to be able to identify when human trafficking is occurring. Let's see, the organization that I worked for currently is called Peace Over Violence. When I worked there, it was the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women many, many years ago. So they're doing a lot of interesting work in the community. They have an amazing leader in their Deaf and Disabled Services program. So they work specifically with communities that are deaf or disabled to either provide services for people who've experienced victimization or to do prevention work around gender-based violence. And so that program there is really, really special. And the leader of that program is an amazing woman and advocate.
Great. Those sound like some great resources. And as you said, that list that's part of the service learning program here at the college is pretty comprehensive. And for students or faculty, if you don't know how to find it, if you just go to the Valley College website and search for service learning, it will bring up the service learning page. It's coordinated by Rick Brossman over there in counseling, and it is a list of all sorts of organizations. It's organized by different categories in terms of what they do with contact information. Really a great resource.
So within your classroom, do you ever I guess for me is I'm comfortable talking about race. I'm comfortable talking about disability. Right? Those are things that I practice. Those are things that I made mistakes at an age where I was young enough where someone can say, I'm not going to fire you for that, but don't say that, or don't say it that way, or maybe you should rethink it this way, maybe here's another book you should read. I think now at this age, I'm terrified at trying to say something or write something that may not come out well. Like how does someone now who is pretty ignorant in this area, right, but is curious and would like to be more informed, where is there a space to like have those conversations?
Well, I think the place that we start. So I'm trained as what I like to identify as a critical sociologist, which means that I use like critical race theory and feminist theory in my classroom, where we start to challenge and think about the existing social systems and structures. And, maybe all those highly educated rich white guys who wrote all that stuff down initially may not have known everybody's experience. And so in the classroom, we certainly have an environment where people can ask questions. But I also think that it's really important that we spend some time in self-analysis, that we try to think about why I'm afraid to say this, why I'm afraid to talk about this or do this action. And if we really explore that, oftentimes it's because we're worried that it might be harmful to somebody or that somebody might be hurt. And so I think it's really important for us to spend time thinking about all of the experiences that people come to our classrooms with, that people come in contact with us have, and to spend more time listening to what they have to say about their own experience. I think it's very easy for us in academia especially to say, well, no, there's a theory for that, right? It's like there's an app for that, right? There's a theory for that. But theories are just theories, right? They're ideas that are open to critique. That's how they became theories. That's why we use them in our classrooms. And so we have to be willing to hear and listen what our students say, and quite frankly, be willing to challenge students' thinking. To not be afraid in the classroom to say, I'm not sure that that's exactly where where you should be coming from, or have you thought about where you got that information? Why are you thinking that way? If we begin to ask people to think about their own experiences, to justify their own thinking, to be critical of that, then very often they're the first people who are like, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that in this environment because somebody might be harmed by that, or because someone might have an experience that's different from my own. So I think self-awareness is really important, and I think we can ask students to do that in a classroom by just asking them, where did you get that information? Where did that come from? Why are you thinking that way? Not in a way that's, why do you think like that? Sure. But, in a way that asks you to really think about the reasons that you do something.
I mean, the one thing I like about Valley College is that I think we are a college where that space is given. But if I went to UCLA, definitely if I went to Yale, definitely if I went to Harvard, I'd be terrified of just, not something coming out clumsy, right? And I do feel like we have a space here on this college where we're pretty forgiving about allowing people to explore how to say something, right?
Yeah, I think that I think it depends too on the focus of your professors, on the type of courses that you're taking. I said this to my own son when he was going to college. I always think it's great to take classes about things that you don't know, right? So a lot of times we decide on a major and we're really interested in that thing and we know a lot about it, and so we keep going. And so I think some of the wiggle room comes when you put yourself in a position where you're outside your comfort zone, where you have to learn instead of talk, right? Where you have to be the person who hears and tries to understand instead of the person who teaches somebody else something. And so where we have the ability to have that environment here on campus, I definitely believe that exists. I think it exists more in some parts of campus than it might in others. And I think it's incumbent on us as faculty and administrators, and even as students, as part of this community, to be willing to create more spaces like that, where we ask for the ability to teach each other in an environment.
So in these last few minutes that we have, because you were a former Valley College student, what advice would you have given yourself when you first walked in here? What do you wish that you knew that you know now?
I think that the advice would have been to hang on. There were multiple points where I thought I just wasn't going to make it. I remember, it's a funny story. It's not necessarily Valley College, but as a student, my very last year at CSUN, I got D's in 2 of the classes in my major that you can't get D's in, right?
Right.
And now, of course, that was the day that you could get D's, but now you can't get D's. And I just thought, what is the point even of going to these classes? I'm just not going to pass them. And when I got my diploma in the mail, I actually made photocopies of it and sent it to everybody I knew because I thought they were going to come take it from me because I not passed. But I think that I felt defeated because I thought, I'm just not gonna make it. And there were a lot of things that were happening in my life that informed, that D, those 2 Ds, and everything else had been fine. But just this idea that you keep plugging away, keep pushing forward. What I often say to my school or to my students. 1 class is better than no classes. 1 semester is better than no semesters. 1 year is better than no years. Because you've been introduced to ideas that you'll never forget. You can't take those things away from you. Right. Somebody can repossess your car, but they can't repossess your education.
Right.
And so, to really just keep plugging away. If I was that adult person giving advice to my student self, I would say, today is just today.
Yeah.
Tomorrow is tomorrow. Just keep, one day at a time, sort of moving through this process.
I think that's such. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that's such an important perspective to share with students. I hear it oftentimes over in the tutoring centers where students are just devastated by the bad grade that they got on a test, and it starts to question their whole sense of who they thought they were and what they were going to be able to do. And so having that sort of longer perspective of understanding that this was just 1 class, there's going to be many more classes. Right. What's the worst case scenario if you failed that class? You could retake the class. I think it's really, really important that message is communicated to the students.
And I think it's important too for us to remember that the grade on a test or the grade we get in a class is 0 indication of the type of person that we are.
That's it. Yeah.
It has nothing to do with who you are as a person. It has a lot to do with circumstances. It has a lot to do with ability to sort of understand a concept in the way that it's being taught, you're being taught to understand it. But, the failure of a test is not the failure of a person.
Right, which I think is a hard distinction for a lot of students because so many folks identify with their grades.
Yes.
I am an A student, or I am a philosophy major. And so much of folks' identity is tied, whether it's with their grades or their work or their possessions. And so sort of finding a way to separate those 2 things out to say, no, if your bad grade was perhaps a product of your process, and studying for that exam. And the process is something that can, is mutable, that can be changed over and over again.
Right. And as faculty, I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that they understand that they've learned that from us, right? That we rank them based on grade. That's our obligation.
Right.
And so I think that we have an obligation, really, to remind them that this doesn't have anything to do with who you are as a person.
Right.
It's an assessment tool. It's one more assessment tool that we use in order to give you the diploma or whatever you're trying to achieve. But people without diplomas, I know a lot of people without diplomas who I think are incredibly smart people, who I would love to spend a lot of time talking to. And I know some people who have lots and lots of degrees that I don't want to spend a lot of time talking to. So it's not really, the person.
Yeah.
It's just a grade. I know it sounds like that's crazy at this moment, but it is really just
I think the conversation we have to have with kids are about goals. What's your goal? Your goal isn't a degree. A degree is not what makes you happy, right?
Right.
The goal for you was to have a different life.
Right.
A different life, and to have your opinion matter.
Right.
And to be able to have access and ability for your opinions to be made into law, to be affected, to be spread out in scale.
Right.
That you wanted to take a piece of the world and change it. A piece of the world that was important to you, that you were informed about. And I think once we start thinking about, does that D really prevent you from doing that? And the answer is no.
Obviously not.
No.
Point in case.
Now, this part of the recording might sound a little different because
Denise was one of the first people we interviewed, and Scott and I didn't have a lot of talent with technology, and the last part of her interview got cut off. But it gave us a great opportunity to touch back with Denise 2, 3 years later just to ask what's been going on in her life. So, Denise, you've been mentioning that you've been working in terms of women's rights internationally. How's that work been going?
Right. Well, I think, as we left off the last time, I had mentioned that I have had the opportunity as a former LA Valley College student to travel to different parts of the world and do women's rights advocacy. Every place from central Mexico to parts of Europe and India, expert tour around India with the US State Department. Really on the ground engaging with and working with women's rights advocates in different parts of the world. And what I always reference as the opportunity sort of to teach and learn from each other. So, clearly, in my expertise and my experience, I had some things to share, but also, just an opportunity to learn. And more recently, that has developed into doing direct advocacy work with at the United Nations level. So the United States has an upcoming what's called Universal Periodic Review. It was actually due in May of 2020, and just like everything else, right, it got shut down and postponed. And the Universal Periodic Review is essentially member states of the United Nations have to account for their human rights record about every 4.5 to 5 years. And what the UN relies on in order to create that accounting is NGOs, grassroots advocates, human rights defenders, and others to be able to document the human rights status on the ground. And so I have been working with a collective of other women and national human rights defenders to engage directly with members of the international community. For example, last Friday, if you could officially call it Friday at about 1:30 a.m., I had the opportunity to be on a phone call with folks in Geneva who are, members of the United Nations who are going to be part of the community that holds the U.S. to account for its record, and sharing some of the experiences of women on the ground. So it's been a really interesting opportunity to engage in this process internationally. The process, the process being, looking at women's rights, looking at the rights of people based on their gender, and how that looks in different environments.
So when you get on the ground, what are you actually doing? Are you talking to educators or politicians, or are you interviewing or doing surveys? What are the sort of on the ground level things you get to touch?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about law and policy, right, is that, sometimes it's not as on the ground as it should be. And so I really, fortunately for me, I bring a lot of on the ground experience, having engaged directly with women who had experienced gender-based violence, who had a lack of access to reproductive health care, right? These are all issues that present themselves to women in the US as human rights issues, right? Having access to maternal care, or to have access to menstrual products if you're incarcerated, right? These are all some of the things that are presenting themselves. There's some recent cases that we've been highlighting at a at an international level of, non-consensual sterilization for women who were incarcerated, both in California and in immigration detention in other parts of the country. And so the way that we engage that work is by finding out what's happening on the ground, either through direct reports or through research that several of the community are doing. Issues are highlighted, and then putting that together in a very legalistic format that has to be submitted in the form of lots of reports and to the UN that requires you to cross-reference lots of international law and national law, etc. The really sort of boring, high-level stuff that really can't possibly do service to what's really happening on the ground, but it's the only format that we have. And so, for example, last Friday in the phone call with advocates in Geneva, folks who work for the UN, diplomats, right? We had about 2 minutes to talk about all of the problems facing women in the US, which certainly doesn't do justice to any of it.
So has it been a surprise, the change in opportunity, or I guess what has happened in the last few years in terms of women's rights, and sort of what's your outlook for the future at this point?
That's a very difficult question right in the moment. But I think that there are a couple of things that I think about, or I thought about when you asked that question. First of all, and I think I probably said this earlier, maybe the last time we connected, I had no idea when I was an LA Valley College student, when I was, 24 years old. I had a 6-month-old kid. I had no idea that, however, 27 years later, I would be on a phone call with diplomats to Geneva, right, trying to address the problems of women in the U.S. at an international level. And so I just think that in terms of how we think about what's going to happen or what's happening now and how it relates to what's going to happen in the future can just be so we can't imagine sometimes, what's going to be happening in our future. And then in terms of hope, I don't think that I've often been accused of being an idealist. And of course, that's an accusation that is fine with me, right? Because I do have hope that we can, create change for women. Certainly we have. At the moment, right, hope is very hard to have because we've had a lot of takeaways, right, over the last several years. So women's experiences have changed significantly based on, just the way that government shifts. So I am an idealist, which means that I ultimately have to have hope, I guess, but it's sometimes more than others difficult to have hope. But, I think one of the things that makes me very hopeful, and I think this is especially evident in doing international work, is that regardless of the experiences that folks have on the ground around their human rights, especially for women, that they still engage in organizing, right? That it's almost like you don't have a choice but to have hope, right? What's the other option? And so there's still so much organizing happening from folks that you would not imagine would be able to access supportive services. So I think that, I think I have to have hope. We all have to have hope, but, we have to also be realists. We have to understand that we can't just sit around and sort of wait for things to happen. We have to work towards those things happening.
Well, I remember when I think it was at Prop 187, when a lot of rights for affirmative action were taken away from California. And I remember talking to someone at UCLA about it, and I felt very distraught about it. And I remember talking to him about it, and he said, and this is a guy who spent his lifetime. He had been a person who'd been working on civil rights with my father, and I remember talking to him about it. He says, sometimes, John, you need a new equilibrium. That sometimes you fight for these rights, and people take them for granted, and sometimes you have to just have them taken away, and then all of a sudden that equilibrium changes, where a portion of the population who just thought that these rights were fought for and they were obtained and could just as easily be taken away, and then a new fight begins. And I remember him telling me that, and following what happened in the aftermath of 187, is that the equilibrium that we created actually is better now. That we look at the number of African American students who are getting degrees from UCs is higher. The number of African American and Hispanic students who are graduating UC and Berkeley remain the same. That a lot of people were then inspired to change. Just a few years ago, we had a few $100 million put toward equity by a Democratic governor, which couldn't have been done because since that moment, it had flipped the state blue, where they could now be aggressive in a different way. So I go back and forth in terms of the conservatism of the judiciary right now, in terms of things are going to get lost, but maybe things need to get lost for a while only to evolve a new equilibrium and to inspire other people to join this fight, which for a long time I think has been fought by the same people, and that effort had been taken for granted.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right, in thinking about that, because certainly we're in election season, and like I often share with my students and others that most of us at a community college level at some point, whether we're teachers or we were students here, at some point somebody had to fight for our right to even vote in an election, right? And so certainly when there were fights for voting, women were on that block, right? They had to fight for the right to vote. And now, right, women's votes are really important and meaningful, right, in terms of decisions around elections. And so I think that is most definitely true, right, that things shift, and sometimes it requires a loss to really understand what that means, right? To have access to those rights. I think that the challenge, though, of course, is that for some people, those lost rights may not be quite as impactful as they are for others. And so, it's like when we think, right now, I don't know how sort of political folks get on these, but I think that there's, enough understanding, for example, about what's happening at the Supreme Court level around women's rights and their access to, healthcare, right, just generally, to understand that, that's a huge risk for a lot of people. But, we really could go back to a time where there are large numbers of women who do not have access to the care that they need, and by definition of that, become unhealthy or maybe even die as a result of that. And so I do think that there's this sort of balance, right? That things have to be, sometimes we need to be shaken a little bit to say, hey, let's, sort of be more active. But then the flip side of it is, some of us probably can afford to lose a little more than others can, right? And so then, how do we sort of make that determination as to what we can lose and what we can't?
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I am very worried about just the immediate loss, that in the process of collecting the data to say this is harmful, that there's just going to be a lot of people where this is harmed. And a lot of times that's what it takes to change a law is now we need data of people who suffered, right? And it seems
Well, and yeah, and the reality is that, and I've said this as somebody who's used the law from even before, going to law school and even before writing laws. I was subject to laws. We're all subject to laws. I experienced the impact of laws. But the reality is that a lot of times the law as it's written isn't very realistic for the people that it's supposed to be regulating, right? So, 187 was not effective in doing even what it said it was supposed to do. And so, and in the meantime, there was such a huge loss, right, to the state. And so the folks so the way that those laws sort of translate to people's experience on the ground is, very different than the people who are sitting in a hall of justice writing it, or even as a Supreme Court justice, right? If we're talking about those sort of current events, they're very far away from the reality of a lot of people's real experiences.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Denice, you've had the opportunity over your career and having spanned so many different types of work, but yet still threading them together and connecting them, that it seems as though you've seen both sides of it. You've been at that higher level writing the laws, but then you've also been feet on the ground in terms of the advocacy that you've been doing. It's
Yeah. And I think that that's a really important point, because I often, and I say this to students, and I really believe it. I say it to students, I say it to, folks, to advocates, that there's this sort of sense that, writing laws and the judiciary and sort of that type of thing is belongs to lawyers, it belongs to politicians, but it really belongs to the people who need it and use it, right? And so, it's something as basic as community college students who show up at a board of trustees meeting, right? Because they're the people who are directly impacted by those legislative and policy decisions that are being made at the board of trustees level. And so, the board of trustees may be politicians or educators or legislators in some ways. But the people who really have the power to create that change are the students and faculty who show up there and hold those folks accountable for that behavior. And so yeah, I do think that, there's this sense of, that kind of higher level stuff is sort of the purview of people who have a specific set of educational, right, apparatus. But the reality is that anybody who is impacted by any of these laws, which is all of us, should be part of that process and should feel comfortable being part of that process.
That's definitely a message, Denice, of hope right there. And optimism in terms of the opportunity and the possibility that people have to I think, make change. And I think we've seen that at a small level, at least. I've seen it, John. I know you've seen it at Valley College when students have become involved, when they have shown up at meetings, when they have held, the powers that be accountable for initiatives, for promises that were supposed to happen. And it's always inspiring to see when that does happen, that it seems as though the needle starts to move in a direction that it's really in favor of the students.
Well, I think the circumstances of the African American students having a counselor, having a space, is directly attributed to the activism that happened by a handful of students on this campus. And I think every time we have a handful of students organize and say, this is exactly what we need, it gives all of us who are trying to push things forward something to point at. And remember that the administrators here, they came here to help people. And even though a lot of times they have to say no because of budget concerns, seeing people in a room saying, this is what I need to be more successful here. This is what we need as a group. Coming in groups of fours or fives into any of these meetings in which we have leadership, it absolutely moves the needle. And I will say that I really respect our administration is that they hear what the students say. And every time we do surveys, every time a student makes a really poignant quote, it is written and it is distributed. So even though it may not seem like people hear, whenever you organize on campus, people hear. And it's really helped a lot of people on this campus move things forward, and has changed the hearts of our administrators to really be self-aware of the gaps that we have on our campus.
Well, and I think leadership too, I think that word leadership is important to unpack, right? Because certainly there are formal leadership positions on in any environment, but if we want to use the example of our campus, right? So in the classroom, there's formal leadership, right? In a professor in a classroom, there's formal leadership in the president of the university, administrators. But that formal leadership is certainly has power, but also, right, those informal leaders have a significant amount of power. And any student or professor, for that matter, could look at their own classroom and see those dynamics at play, right? You certainly have somebody who has a formal leadership role, but you can point out the students who are the informal leaders and have the capacity to organize for positive or negative, right, within the context of a classroom. And so, I think that it's important, and this has been particularly true in doing work around grassroots women's leadership, both nationally, locally, and internationally, is that it's not always the formal leaders who have the best solutions, number one, but also who are able to push for change in the same way. Oftentimes they're constrained by institutions that have certain rules that they have to follow. And so really those informal leaders, whether it's students or others in the community, are the ones who are able to push the needle on some of the things that are important to folks.
Yeah. Well, Denice, you've been so generous with your time meeting with us twice. If students wanted to meet you and just talk to you about just your career path and just opportunities to fight for women's rights, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, certainly I have my email, and probably in these times that's the best way. It's hard to get a hold of anybody on campus these days, and we shouldn't be. I was trying to remember it off the top of my head. It's labertld@laccd.edu. And I'm happy to, spend some time chatting with anyone who has an interest in any of these issues. And I think I want to reiterate, as a former LA Valley College student, who would have never imagined, to be in the classroom as a faculty member, as a professor, but also not have imagined to have done so many of the things I've had the opportunity to do. I would love to chat with students about what they're thinking about their lives, and especially if they are at the point where they feel like, which I felt like many times when I was a student, I don't know if this is going to work. I just don't know if I can make it, because I think that you probably can.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a rare chance to listen to an interview before we're putting a capper on it. And let me just tell you, yesterday, just listening to your story one more time and just hearing the struggle and the opportunities and this following of a passion, and then where it led to something so fulfilling, it always gives me hope. It gives me just real optimism for what's possible. So I think your life story is really at the end of the day, the thing that really gives me hope in terms of the fight that's happening right now. So thank you so much.
Thank
Agreed.
you so much, Denice.